I'm Femi OK. Today on the stream, we have been talking about global warming for decades. But now that we're finally seeing parts of the world really heating up, repetitive heat waves, could this be the change that will make politicians around the world finally take action? That is our show for today. If you're on YouTube, take part in the discussion. You're welcome to be part of our conversation. We start with Fernando, who lived in a village in Spain until recently when wildfires burned down his house. Here's what he told the news earlier.
Kind of emptiness. Feel an emptiness inside. I tend to be positive. But when I think of the mountains, the woods, lots of mountains, lots of hundreds and thousands of trees, I think, well, what's going to be left? It's not like that. It's not a place I grew up. I grew up with. Sorry. Don't know what we're going to find. It's going to be just. No trees, nothing, no, I don't know. Don't want to think about it.
The human face and consequences of global warming right there in Spain. Hello, Kendra, Professor Nosheen, Yuri. Thank you so much for being part of today's show. We're talking about, is this the moment when our politicians will appreciate climate change and take action? Kendra, please say hello. Introduce yourself to our audience around the world.
Sure. My name is Kendra Pierre-Lewis, and I'm a senior climate reporter with the Gimlet Spotify podcast, How to Save the Planet.
Professor Nosheen, welcome to the stream. Please introduce yourself to our global viewers.
Hello, I'm Nosheen Anwar. I'm a professor of urban planning at a university based in Karachi, Pakistan, and I research on cities and climate change.
Good to have you. And Yuri, nice to have you back on the stream. Please remind our audience who you are and what you do.
Hello, I'm Yuri Rogel. I'm Director of Research at the Grantham Institute for Climate Change and Environment at Imperial College in London.
Thank you so much, panel, for being part of today's show. Looking here on my laptop, heat waves and fires scorched Europe, Africa and Asia. This was mid-July. Looking at this image, I remember a train going through Spain and there were flames, wildfires either side of this ordinary passenger train. Runways in the UK melting, tarmac melting, people so hot. I am just wondering, Kendra, out of all of your time of being a climate reporter, why is the world not better prepared for these high temperatures?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. This isn't even the first time Europe's been extremely hot. There were the big European heat waves of 2003. Europe was quite hot in 2010. And the reality is that almost as soon as these events happen, we seem to forget. And there isn't enough impetus. The politicians in power, the people in power, don't really feel compelled to act on climate change, to both in the sense of mitigating, cutting the use of fossil fuels so that we don't continue having these kinds of extreme events, or even worse, and adapting. So doing the things that we know we need to do to better serve ourselves moving forward, because there's a certain amount of warming locked in. I think we're just incredibly short-sighted.
Yuri, as a climate scientist, are you not exasperated by now? Why are you still a climate scientist? Why don't you just retire? Because no one is listening.
Well, I'm a climate scientist because I hope that sometime we will find a solution. And that solution is, of course, to bring down our emissions and to live in a society that is well adapted to climate change. At the same time, I'm also not surprised that people are still continue to suffer under climate change under these even modest levels of climate change. It is well established that we are already ill prepared for our current climate. And with climate change progressing and heat extremes arriving that we have never seen before in recorded history, it is absolutely no surprise that there are so many forest fires, that there's so much suffering, and that there's so many health impacts.
Nosheen, what does being unprepared actually mean? What have you seen recently and on the lead up to our climate getting warmer and warmer and warmer, where you're saying that we're not ready for this?
So for me, my work is largely centered on the urban context, especially across South Asia and cities, especially in Pakistan. And cities present a specific kind of a conundrum as far as warming is concerned, because it's not just about heat waves, which have a more regional context, but also about urban heat island effects. So cities like Karachi, where I'm based at the moment, they've gotten considerably warmer, much warmer over the last 60, 70 years or so. And being prepared essentially means that are you rolling out the kinds of heat wave alert plans and health infrastructure planning and urban planning and energy efficiency plans, and that actually target vulnerable communities, the poorest of the poor. And I'm basically not seeing any of those kinds of things happening.
And just for people who are not meteorologists, an urban heat island effect is a city that creates so much energy that it's as warmer than the area around it. So London tends to be warmer than the surrounding area, and New York tends to be warmer than the surrounding area, just because of how many people are using energy in that city. That's a urban heat island effect. Let's go to YouTube. I want to bring in Shivansh here. Shivansh says this is a turning point for the public who can vote. They hold their leaders accountable to the same level that they hold autocrats, oligarchs, despots, and bad leaders. That seems to be a very positive spin. Let me think. Kendra, does the public have power right now?
I think, so I can speak best in a US context. I'm based in New York. I think oftentimes too much of the conversation, so in the United States, I think on a federal level, there is this really big logjam. But to the professor's point, when you're thinking about extreme weather events, when you're thinking about heat, there's a lot that can happen on a municipal or on even the state level. And some of that is happening and a lot of it is not. One of the things that's really frustrating, I think, in the United States is we build these boxes essentially, and we expect to be able to pump a lot of energy into them to have them be an appropriate temperature. So we have a lot of heating when it's cold outside, we have a lot of air conditioning when it's warm outside, and that is a paradoxical effect, which is it exacerbates climate change. We're not designing homes and communities for the climate that they're in, never mind the climate that they will be facing in the future. So yeah, on the one hand, I think we need to hold our leaders accountable, but I think when we're thinking about who our leaders are, that's at every stage. That's just not on a federal or on a global level. It's also, who are you electing to planning board? Who are you running for planning board? Are you even going to your planning board meetings? Like, you have to think at every layer of sort of how your government functions in order to really be able to adapt to what we're facing and really to be able to hold people accountable.
You said the reason why you remain a climate scientist is because you hope that your science will persuade people to take action. What do you need global leaders to be doing at this stage?
Well, it's quite clear at the global, at the international level, it's important that stringent targets are set that reduce emissions already in the next decade, starting from today, and that reach net zero global CO2 emissions, carbon dioxide, that is, by mid-century. That's absolutely essential in order for us to stop warming from increasing continuously further. The global leaders discuss these targets under the UN. That's called the UNFCCC. Every year there is a big summit. The challenge of these processes is that countries just come to the table with their best proposal, with their pledges. And until now, if you add up all these pledges, they really don't add up to anything that is even close to what is needed simply to stop climate change,
Sure.
Even not to limit it to 1.5 or well below 2 degrees, what we are trying to do.
Do you think the leaders are just making stuff up to make them sound good, but knowing that there's no commitment and then they walk away? Nassim, go ahead.
May I just also mention that there are certain categories of populations who are simply off the radar in the broader talk on climate change, and especially the impact of heat and heat waves. So heat is a complex thing. Mm-hmm. And so there's a particular category of populations across the world, and that's migrants and refugees, asylum seekers, people on the move across borders, within territories. So the International Displacement Monitoring Center took out a report in 2021, and it estimates that something like 30 million people were displaced, largely, and these displacements can be attributed to climate events. So, so there are these specific categories of populations that are simply not on the radar when we're talking about taking care of people when it comes to the building of health infrastructures or urban planning at the municipal level, at the local levels. Aside from the fact that that's a challenge, quite a huge challenge in countries like Pakistan, where at the local level, municipal entities are quite weak and governance systems are very top-down, so there isn't much of a conversation to begin with. But across the globe, this very important issue of, how are migrant refugees going to be taken care of?
Yeah.
And this is a huge challenge even right now in Europe, for instance. So there are certain specific categories of populations that have completely fallen off the radar, that are not even brought into the broader conversations on, how do we go around protecting people when it comes to heat and heat waves, generally speaking.
How do we protect people? Go ahead, Kendra.
I was just going to say there's another layer too, which is like, as climate change progresses, there are some people who are in places that they're just going to have to move because of the realities of the pressures that climate change is putting on them. But when you look at sort of the quote unquote migrant crisis that the United States has been facing for several years coming from Central America, a lot of those people are coming from regions where they wouldn't have to move if there was even a small investment by the countries that created this problem in helping them stay on their land, right? So there's this also tension too of, investments in ag and investments in climate smart ag and investments in water storage that would enable people in, for example, the dry corridor of Central America to stay put. Because I also feel like part of the conversation that gets lost when we talk about migration is that many of these people are being pushed, right? They don't want to leave. And so if there are things, because it's a form of trauma. So if there's things that we can do as a global society to help people stay, that should also be part of the conversation.
Kendra, what can we do?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things that has been coming up every year at the UN conference is the fact that some of the countries that are disproportionately harmed by climate change are the ones that have contributed least to the problem, and that the countries, the global north countries like the United States, countries like those in Western Europe, should be contributing to essentially loss and damage. But nobody wants to acknowledge that loss and damage is happening. Nobody wants to acknowledge.
Have you seen those rich countries squirm when the global south developing countries bring this up? This is not our pollution. This is not our global warming. You are responsible. Where is the money? Nobody says anything. Right,
Exactly.
Yuri? Yeah.
I think here, if I may, I think that's a really good point, and it comes back to your earlier question about, can politicians just show up at the UN, make some statements, and then
leave.
disappear?
Yes.
And exactly. Actually, at the UN itself, ultimately it's kind of peer pressure between different countries and blaming and shaming and diplomatic efforts that will kind of entice countries to follow up on their commitments. But one important dimension to hold policymakers or decision makers or governments accountable nowadays is climate change litigation. Climate change litigation, on the one hand, because of impacts that are occurring and that are caused by past emissions, either from countries or from companies, but also climate change litigation that is more human rights based, and where people take their governments to court because their climate targets are not ambitious enough.
Yuri, that's really interesting. Let me bring in, as we've been talking about United Nations, Antonio Guterres, who is the UN Secretary General. He has been adamant about countries working together to act because the climate is warming. He said this in mid-July, and it was something that really caught my attention. Let's have a listen, let's have a look.
Excellencies, 8 months ago we left COP26 with 1.5 degrees on life support. Since then, its pulse has weakened further. Greenhouse gas concentration, sea level rise and ocean heat have broken new records. Half of humanity is in the danger zone from floods, droughts, extreme storms and wildfires. No nation is immune. Yet we continue to feed our fossil fuel addiction. This has to be the decade of decisive climate action. That means trust, multilateralism and collaboration. We have a choice, collective action or collective suicide. It is in our hands.
Yuri, that for me is a mic drop moment from the UN Secretary General right there. But who's listening and who's acting? If you could share with our audience, our viewers on Al Jazeera, who is actually changing the way their country is operating, adapting for hotter weather, adapting for extreme weather. Who's doing that right now?
Well, there are a few countries that have climate targets that seem to be going in the right direction. Unfortunately, in many cases, these are targets that are not necessarily followed up with the correct policies. A good example of this is just the country I work in, and that's the UK. Ambitious near-term target. They have an ambitious net zero target for the mid-century. But every year, their own kind of climate watchdog, there is a Committee on Climate Change. Every year, the Committee on Climate Change shows that the policies that the government is actually putting in place are not enough to meet those targets that are being announced, and that's really worrying, of course.
Nazeem, are you seeing climate action happening in different countries, different parts of the world, different regions, where you can say, okay, they get it?
Well, so within sort of where I live, sort of within South Asia, it's a very uneven terrain. So in India, for instance, at the at the national level, there seems to be greater action on sort of introducing policies and programs that are related not only to managing heat, but also for cooling. Pakistan has been a lot slower on this side. In the Karachi context, there has been action, for instance, since the 2015 heat wave, which was quite unprecedented, which triggered the death of close to 2,000 persons. And these were largely vulnerable populations. Since then, we've had a heat action plan, a heat wave emergency plan in place. But its outreach is quite limited. We're actually undergoing, at the Karachi Urban Lab, we're undergoing a 15,000 household and 5,000 commercial survey, and we're discovering that by and large in a city of 25 million, based on this particular representational survey, maybe only 50% of the respondents say that they have access to these heat wave alerts. So even in those instances where certain actions are unrolling on ground, there's a lot of inconsistency and a lot of debate about how these actions are actually reaching out people. And then there is also this very big question of, what do we mean by adaptation in the context of extreme weather events such as a warming planet and heat waves? Can the human body really adapt to extreme heat? Are we necessarily going in the right direction when we use the word adaptation in this context? Or is the word risk mitigation and risk management more appropriate?
What's the difference, Nazeem?
I think
what's the difference?
So, well, first of all, I mean, physiologists have a lot more to say about, the extent to which the human body can adapt to these crazy temperatures. And and there's a good deal of debate out there right now within the academy, more broadly speaking, on what kinds of temperatures are appropriate, in this present context, especially when you combine ambient temperature with humidity indices, which are particularly dangerous. So in a city like Karachi, which happens to be very humid for most of the time throughout the year, when you combine that with very high ambient temperatures, you're looking at a pretty lethal context in terms of the impact of extreme heat or chronic heat or acute heat. So in these contexts, there's a big question mark. What do we really mean by adaptation? So risk mitigation are the small things that we can do, which is introduce cooling centers such as parks, air-conditioned rooms, and passive forms of shade. Heat management is the big challenge because heat management is about implementing and putting in place really, really solid health infrastructures, and also putting in place the kinds of urban planning interventions that make cities resilient. And these are the kinds of things actually that are not happening on ground at all. And in fact, we're just pouring more asphalt, cement, concrete into our built environment, which is also part of the reason why we have insane UHI.
Such a depressing conversation, because everything that you're advising, that Kendra is telling us about, it's not happening. Kendra, I want to share with you a youngster, because I think often right now when we're talking about climate activism, young people, young climate activists are actually leading the way. This is Lissy Priaka, who spoke to us a little bit earlier about what she is expecting from global leaders. Have a listen to her, and then I'd like you to react immediately at the end of the video. Here she is.
Well, our leaders need to trust each other first to solve the global climate crisis. The biggest problem is that they don't trust each other. We want clean air to breathe, clean water to drink, and clean planet to live. Asking clean air to breathe, clean water to drink, and clean planet to live is all our basic rights. You can just see how millions of children are dying due to the air pollution crisis, and how millions of people are suffering due to the heat wave crisis in Asia and in Europe. Sacrificing the lives of the millions of children for the failures of our leaders is unacceptable at any cost.
I think that she is more optimistic about our leaders than I am. I think that they're aware of what's happening. I think that there are too many people in positions of power who think that they will be unaffected by what's coming, that they can hide themselves in their bunkers in New Zealand or wherever, and they won't be affected by the climate crisis. And that's just functionally not true. And because that they've been able to sort of protect themselves from so many of the harms that have occurred so far, that that it seems a distant problem to them. They don't recognize it as a problem that's close to them. I also think some of it, at least in the United States, is generational. It's not lost on many people that were essentially ruled by a gerontocracy. Many of our leaders are in their 70s or in their 80s, and they're not going to live to see the worst effects of it. And you often hear that in their rhetoric, right? They talk about what their grandchildren will face. There's no recognition about what we're already facing. I'm in New York City, and last summer, plenty of people died in their basement from severe rain, right? Like this isn't a future problem, and that's what I think so many people still struggle with. Is it's not a future problem, it's here. There's an incident like a heat wave or maybe a flood, and they recognize that extreme weather event, but they call it a natural disaster when there's nothing natural about it, and then they forget about it the second it's over.
Kendra, you answered the question that we started with. I'm just going to go to my laptop before going to you, Yuri, and then finally you, Nassine. You have a minute each. Will extreme weather spur world leaders to act on climate change? Kendra's no. Yuri, your thoughts?
I hope so. Well, because in response to also what others have said, I think it's really important to understand that there's also limits to adaptation, limits that are increasingly clearly identified. Either soft limits because our society can't change fast enough, but also hard limits beyond which humans don't function anymore, or beyond which our crop production and our food production is severely impaired. And I think that is something to keep in mind, and is a high risk that we need to be able to mitigate.
Nassine.
Yeah, Femi, I'm hopeful. And I'm hopeful because sitting where I am in Karachi, I see a host of different activists and non-governmental organizations on ground that are acting, in terms of, of a collective force. And where my hope gets a little unstable is when I look to our leaders. I think this is what our colleagues over here are also saying. But we don't have a choice, and so we have to act fast, and we have to act urgently.
Mm-hmm. Just going to end with some comments from our YouTube viewers. Thank you so much. I love that you're weighing in here. Andy Ross, I'm Native American. The land that I own and the land my family owns has oil and gas under it. We are doing our part by not letting big oil drill on our land. I'm going to go back to YouTube one more time and then bring in Nick's thought here. Nick thinks that litigation is fine, but generally the bodies prosecuting have no teeth. See the emphasis on local bioregional self-sufficiency combined with preparing for influx of climate refugees. You're so good out there on YouTube. I wish that you were our global leaders. Then we might get some action. Thank you so much to our YouTube viewers, to Yuri, to Nassine and Kendra. I'll see you next time. Take care, everybody.